What's up guys, Chris Schwartz-Edmisten here from Schwartz-Edmisten Web Design. In today's video, we're going to be looking at how to create this cool floated banner section in Squarespace 7.1. So I'm here in my Squarespace 7.1 site. I have my first intro section, and then I have this section that I want to be the floated banner section. And then, I have the rest of my page below it. So the way that we're going to structure this is basically we're going to target the section above the section that we want to be the banner overlay. Because obviously if you're splitting a section between two other sections, there's always going to be a banner right before it. And the reason that we're going to do that is we have to then add some padding to the bottom of this section so that when this section splits it, it's going to cover up a portion of this. And so we want to add some padding to the bottom of this section so to compensate for that. So that's why we're going to be targeting the first section. And in CSS, you work your way down. So we couldn't target this section with CSS and then tell Squarespace to then target the section above it. CSS doesn't work backwards like that, but we can target this section and then give it some properties and then tell it to target the section after and give that properties and then target the section after that one and give it properties as well, all by just targeting this one section. So the first thing I'm going to do is right click and click inspect, and that'll bring up my Chrome inspect tools. Now, we're going to grab the data section ID for this section here. So go to the section, copy the data section ID, and we target data elements with brackets by surrounding them in brackets in CSS. So then I'm going to open up some curly brackets and we're going to write all of our CSS in here under this one data section ID. So the first thing that we'll want to do is just add some padding to the bottom of this section. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a padding bottom of 100 pixels, and you'll see that adds some padding to the bottom of this section. So now we have our padding bottom right here in the Chrome Inspect tools. You can see it just gives it a little bit of extra room. So we can tweak that as needed, but right now that's good enough for now. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and target the section after this section here. And the way we can do that is use ampersand, which basically just tells Squarespace, Squarespace uses the less preprocessor, which allows us to do some cool shortcuts. So the ampersand is one of those shortcuts, and it basically says repeat whatever is here and essentially place it there. So we're representing whatever's up here with an ampersand. So then we can use the adjacent sibling selector, the plus sign, and then target the next section. So now we are targeting the section after whatever data section ID we put here. So in this case, we're now targeting this section here. So what we want to do is go ahead and set this section's position to absolute. And this will remove it from the document flow, and it allows us to then position it how we want it on the page. So in this case, we do have to give it an important tag to override Squarespace's current styling. So, a note on that important tag. So if I go ahead and remove this important tag, if I bring up the Chrome Inspect tools, we can see that our styling was being crossed out. It wasn't being applied because it wasn't more specific than the position relative that gets placed on there by Squarespace. So Squarespace's targeting was more specific. So our position absolute was not being rendered. So the important tag, when we add that, that's just telling the browser, ignore all other conflicting styles that would conflict with this and make sure that this is rendered. So now you can see when we add the important tag, Squarespace's position relative gets crossed out and our position absolute gets applied. Perfect. So it's working right now. We just can't see it because we need to add a higher Z index. So we'll just add a Z index of 30. That's a good safe number. I'm pretty sure a Z index of 2 would have also worked. Yep. But 30 is just a good, in case you have Z indexes on other sections that could conflict, 30 is a good safe number. It's a lot higher. We know that our banner won't be covered up. Perfect. Okay, so then the other thing we want to do is go ahead and center this on the page. So we want to make sure that we're splitting the banner above it, and then we also want to make sure that it's centered on the page. So the way that we can do that is first we'll give it a left property of 50%, and this will move it 50%. It'll move its left edge 50% of the way across the screen. So now to center it, we have to move it back 50% of this element's own width. And we don't know what that width is. So the best way to do it when the width isn't known, the best way to recenter it is to use the transform property. And we're going to translate it back 50% on the x-axis, and then we also want to move it up 50% on the y-axis. So the transform translate property, and I do need a comma in between them. The transform translate property is a really cool way of moving absolutely positioned elements. So now we're perfectly centered on the page, and we're splitting the two sections, which is great. Our padding bottom is working right now. It's not covering up the content like it might otherwise would have. You know, it's a lot closer. Cool. So now we need to add some padding to the following section as well. So now we can just kind of copy our previous method of targeting the following sections by targeting ampersand plus section plus section. So basically we're saying target this section and then target the next and then target the next. So we're now targeting this section here, and we'll go ahead and add a padding top, and let's just do 100 pixels as well. Okay, so that's why we're using this method of targeting the first section. I feel like it's probably more clear now. We can target one data section ID and manipulate 3 sections. So when we want to go and add this float styling to a different section, all we have to do is add the data section ID of the section above the float section, and it'll automatically inherit all these properties. So this is the best way, the best written CSS in terms of, you know, updating this in the future. All we have to do is make a list of data section IDs. Okay, so right now our content is pretty small, so we need to start controlling its width so that it's in accordance with the rest of the content on the page. So the two properties that control width, the width of your content on the page, come from the site spacing panel. So if you go to design spacing, you have these two properties. You have the page width max and the site margin. So I have a video about that. I'll throw it up in the little card on this video. So go check out that section or that video if you want to learn about how those properties affect your site's width and spacing. And I would just definitely go watch that after this video, because those two properties are very important, and they're going to affect when you do custom CSS like this. So my page width max is 1200 pixels, and my site margin is 6 viewport widths. So that is pretty important. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a site width variable up here, which is 1200 pixels. And I'm going to create a site margin, which was 6 viewport widths. And I'm just going to save those in variables up there. So we're going to be using these properties to make sure that our floated section perfectly aligns with the rest of the content on our website. So now that we have those stored in variables, let's go ahead and control the width for this floated banner. So if we want this page, this floated page, to be 100% of the width of the page, let's go ahead and inspect this content wrapper above it. So basically it gets a max width of 1200 pixels because that was my site width. So the page content can't get any wider than 1200 pixels. But there's also this site margin as well. So it also has a padding right of 6 viewport width units and a padding left of 6 viewport width units. So if I want this, the edge of this floated section here to line up with this content here, we're gonna have to give it a max width of 1200 pixels, and we're also going to have to give it a margin left of 6 viewport width units and a margin right of 6 viewport width units. So first, let's go ahead and set up the width calculation. So for the width, we're going to want it to be 100%. And we have to set up our calc function here. So we want it to be there we go. 100% minus 12 viewport width units, because that's 6 on the left and 6 on the right. And then we also want to set up a max width of 1200 pixels. And so because we identified what our site's exact site padding properties were, we now get it to match exactly with the rest of our content. So if you do want it to match the rest of your content, that is how you'll want to do it. You'll want to look at what your site padding or site margin and site width properties are, and then you'll want to use those exactly. So that way it'll be perfectly in line. So if you don't care about these kinds of things, if you just want, you can just set a width of like 80 viewport width units. And so let's do like 90. So if you just define like an explicit width on it, like 90 viewport width units, then it'll always be 90% of the viewport. Or let's go back down to 80, because I think that looked a little bit better. In this case, it'll always be 80% of the viewport. So that's an option too. If you wanted to stick out farther than the rest of your content, then you don't have to do all these calculations to get it to line up with the rest of your content. So that is also a perfectly fine solution as well. But I want to make this harder on us. I want to make it more complicated because there will be people who do want it to match. And so might as well cover the harder thing for those people. Okay, so a way that we can set this up is with variables. So instead of explicitly defining the max width down here in the CSS, let's go ahead and replace it with our site width variable, and you'll see nothing will change, but now I can just update my site width variable here in case it changes. I don't have to go sorting through all my CSS. So now if we were to write other different modules that relied on the site width and site margin values, we already have our variables stored. So when we go to write that CSS, we can just write that CSS with variables up here. And if it changes, we can change it in one place and it'll update on all our different modules that we write. So that's why variables are super powerful. And it's a much better way of managing your CSS when you're using common properties. Especially when those common properties could change. Okay, so this is going to be our floated banner section. Okay. All right, so the next thing that we have to do is put in our site margin here. This variable. So when we put variables in a calc function, already our calc function looks a little bit different than normal calc functions, and that's because we have to because we're using the less preprocessor, we have to add kind of this funky little this squirrely thing, and then we have to contain the calculation in quotation marks as well. So it gets even squirrelier when you're using a variable within the calculation. So when you're using a variable in the calculation, you do the squirrely first, and then you add some quotation marks. Then you do your calc function, and then in here, when you want to use a variable, you have to do the @ symbol, and then you open up some curly brackets, and then you do the name of your variable, in this case, site margin. and then you close this little squirrely thing. Perfect. And then we have to make sure that we have our ending quotation mark. Okay, and so for our width here, we want to make sure that we're multiplying this by 2. Boom, and now it jumps to the perfect width. So now if our site width were to change, like let's go ahead and change those values real quick. Design, spacing. Let's change this to 1715, and this will be to 8 viewport width units. So we'll go to here and we'll do 1715, and we'll do 8 viewport width units. Boom, it automatically lines up. So this is nice for you guys. Like when you go to my blog post and just copy this CSS into your site, all you have to do is update these variables with your information, and then it'll automatically line up with the content. So we've done a lot of the hard work here to make it very easy on us in the future in case things change. Okay, so let's see. So now, if we go down to mobile, let's go ahead and address the mobile view right now. So this looks good, but there may be the case where you don't want it to be an overlay on mobile. So I've had that asked before. How do I not make it an overlay? How do I just make it go back to a normal section on mobile? And that's a great question. And I believe if we just drop down here to this section here, if we take away this position absolute, and then we take away the transforms, let's see, and if we take away the width and the max width and the left property and the Z index, and save it and refresh, let's see what happens. Okay, yeah, it goes back. So what we can do is, if you don't want any of this stuff to apply on mobile, we can, inside here, we can just add a media query. So at media screen, and in this case, we'll do a minimum width, a min width of 641 pixels. Open up some curly brackets, and we'll just surround all of this in our min width media query. So now all of this CSS that we wrote previously will only apply to screen sizes of 641 pixels and bigger. And since our mobile breakpoint is 640 pixels, this is only going to apply to screen sizes bigger than mobile. So that's what a min width media query is. So now when we get down to mobile, boom, it's just another section. But when we are on larger screen sizes, we get our overlay section back. Okay, so that is how easy it is to add the overlay. Let's go ahead and add it to another section. So I want this to be my floated overlay here, down here. So I'll right click and I'll get the data section ID for this section. I'll go ahead and add it to my list by adding a comma and then targeting our data section ID with brackets. Now you can see this section was clearly set to a taller section height, and it's taken a lot of vertical space. So I'm gonna go to the section editor and I'm just gonna change its section height to small so that it's not like such a huge section. So as I save that, it's looking good. It's not covering up any content. As I go down to smaller screen sizes, still looking good, still not covering up any content, and it goes back to a normal banner on mobile. Perfect. Okay, so there you go, guys. That's how easy it is to add the section overlay to your Squarespace 7.1 websites. We got this cool floated banner section here. I'm gonna have all of this code in a blog post linked down in the description below, so you can go ahead and grab it in the description below this video. That is it for this tutorial, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have a nice community of Squarespace web designers growing here. If you want to learn more about customizing your Squarespace website with CSS, then I highly recommend subscribing to the channel. And if you do, I'll see you in the next one.